As of now, the information we have is that 2 people were injured. One man was hit by a shrapnel fragment, the other wounded person was buried under a wall. I've ordered a 5-kilometre zone to be closed off. The evacuation of all civilians from within this 5-kilometre zone is underway.
Well, I think first we understand the context. Crimea is clearly where Russians are providing military lines of communication up into the conflict in southern Ukraine. So it's evidently a keen target for the Ukrainians. It could have been the Western weapons that we've been supplying, although it's quite a long way for those to reach. It could have been a special forces mission. It could have been drones. It could have been sabotage. The one thing it's almost certainly not is an accident. I think particularly a week ago, when the Russians claimed that there was an accidental explosion. If you look at the satellite imageries, it's pretty evident there's been some surgical strikes against military equipment. And so this is a very carefully calculated and very effective targeting of Russia's rear resupply area for that conflict in the south.
Would Ukraine have the special forces needed to operate behind enemy lines to do something like this?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, the whole country, because of its background, has a mix of Russians and Ukrainians that are endemic in the population. So it's quite difficult to target exactly who is friend and foe in this conflict. But it will be conjectured to try and establish. I mean, none of the military sources I have know whether they were special forces, but there is no doubt at all that the key element here is President Zelensky has been fighting a war of attrition in the Donbass, a war where, despite heroic fighting, gradually they've been ceding ground to the Russians in a conflict which is very difficult for Zelensky to win. What he's very effectively done, though, is try to seize the initiative by stating publicly he wants to liberate Kherson. And I think all of the attacks we're seeing now, whether it's Zaporizhzhia or the Crimea, are all linked to the efforts to liberate Kherson, which of course was taken by the Russians early in the war. It's the west side of the Dnipro River. The Ukrainians have been blowing the bridges on the Dnipro River to isolate the Russian forces there. The Russians have still been firing on them from the east bank, but of course they're vulnerable. So the Russians are now hiding in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility, knowing full well that the Ukrainians can't fight back. And I think what the Ukraine is also doing is targeting the rear area of supplies, like ammunition dumps, etc., just to make life more difficult for the Russians so that the Ukrainians have a better chance of liberating Kherson. And the timeline is critical because in a few weeks' time, the weather will turn in Ukraine, we'll head towards winter, maneuver warfare will be a lot more difficult. And I think we're seeing some posturing here from both sides trying to get a favourable position before the winter pause comes about.
So much.
You're absolutely right. But a lot of this depends on the information you're being fed. And of course, the Russians are controlling the flow of information to their own domestic audiences. Whereas in Ukraine, where we have Western press operating without restrictions, we're getting a better, clearer story of what's going on. In Crimea itself, dominated by the Russians, dominating the information picture, there's still people going around their everyday business, really unaware of the real impact of war until suddenly the war is brought to them. And that's what Ukrainians are doing very effectively, is just making clear that just because you're not on the front line doesn't mean you're safe. And inevitably, that will have an impact not only on the morale of those people in Crimea, although to be fair, there's a long history of suffering on Crimea in various wars. So I don't suppose that'll make a great deal of difference. But in terms of the soldiers, a lot of conscripts in the Russian army now find themselves at the far extremities of reach in Kherson. They're in unfamiliar territory. They're surrounded by Ukrainians. It's not a friendly environment for them. They're occupying power and now find themselves potentially isolated when they're not professional soldiers. They don't have professional soldier training, and that will make life very difficult for them. But I would not underestimate the challenge of retaking Kherson. It's very difficult to conduct urban warfare. There's a lot of fighting lies ahead.
Okay. Sean Bell, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on BBC News. This is it in a satellite image here. Both sides, Russia and Ukraine, accusing each other of shelling areas nearby. Kyiv saying that Moscow has hidden ammunition at the site, effectively holding it hostage. International nuclear inspectors are trying to reach the plant, but haven't yet been able to do so. With the latest, here's our correspondent in Kyiv, Ugo Bashega.
President Zelensky again used his nightly address to talk about the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power complex. He accused Russia again of terrorism and of nuclear blackmail and urged countries around the world to impose more sanctions on Moscow. Now, for days, Russia and Ukraine have traded accusations of who is to blame for shelling the complex. The Ukrainians accuse Russia of turning this nuclear facility into a military base, using it to launch attacks against Ukrainian targets, knowing that Ukrainian forces are unlikely to retaliate. The Russians reject those accusations. They say Russian troops are there protecting this nuclear facility, but this level of military activity around a nuclear facility has raised fears of a catastrophe. There have been growing calls for Russia to allow international monitors to visit this nuclear facility, but so far there are no signs that any kind of deal can be reached, at least